Hello and welcome to Cloud Forest Vibes. My name's Bobby, and this is how I grow orchids and carnivorous plants. Hello and welcome to Cloud Forest Vibes. We have a beautiful morning. I'm spending all day in the greenhouse today, so I plan on shooting a couple videos. I'm a little bit behind. It has been just absolute madness the last couple weeks. So having that said, I'm going to hop to it. We're not taking a look around in this greenhouse yet, at least not in this video. We are going to take a look at a couple plants out of the orchidarium. So some of you may or may not know, I do have some new subscribers, but I do have a lot of moss that I have been culturing. And I've got two different types of sphagnum moss, and I've got down here in there, one of those tubs on the left, I've got forest moss that I'm just starting to get going and see if I can start playing around with. I'm going to go ahead and get us set up on the tripod out at the table, and we'll have a nice close look at some of these plants that I've got mounted with some of this live moss, and we're going to have a little talk about it. It's not as cut and dry as I thought it would be. There's actually a lot that goes into keeping the moss alive and keeping the plant happy when it's mounted with the moss. So let's go have a look, and hopefully I can shed some light on that situation. Okay, so here we are at the table, and I've got all the plants out that I've got mounted currently with live sphagnum moss. These are two Lepanthopsis. This is one Lepanthes. This is a Masdevallia. They were divided off the same plant, but that's it. One Masdevallia, two mounts, and a Dracula species as well. They all seem to do really well with the moss, but there is a bit of a caveat. I will say this is my first run using moss, and I didn't really account for how much the moss would grow. This plant is a great example where you can see the moss has started to kind of grow out of control. It's almost taller than the plant. Another example is this Dracula. You can see the moss has really taken off along with the plant itself. I've got new growths all over the place, really healthy looking plant, but the moss really is starting to get a little bit out of control. So something I've learned about this moss is that you have to give it a haircut. It's great, it's actually kind of easy to do, and what I've done is been able to propagate more moss on the mount itself over and over again by doing this. So the easiest way to do this is just snip the heads like so. Careful not to cut your own ties. It cleans it up quite nice, and you can take all those little heads and you can stick them back down in under the string, or the under the fishing line, and it just fills out the mount even more. You could also take this moss and put it back in your moss bin, so if you wished, propagate more moss out of the moss you've already used, recycling it. But it's just as easy and fast to go ahead and let your moss be moss with the rest of its mossy friends, if you will, and recycle it right back onto its mount. And voila, there's the first one, nice and cleaned up. And that is the easiest way to do this. I'm going to go ahead and go through these. I'll clean them all up and I'll show you guys. But what I want to say first is I do use two kinds of moss, like I mentioned before. This is the live red sphagnum. It so far has been a much more compact growing species, and I really do like it. If you're going to use it with a smaller plant like this, you can see the difference. This stuff grows up wild, grows through the plant. It can get a little bit fiddly trimming it out of small plants. So finding one that grows a bit more compact is a really big bonus. So I do have the live red on both of the Masdevallia mounts, but I have it mixed with the other one, the normal green sphagnum moss. And you can tell, you can really see there's a big difference between the two florets, the two heads, and the growth pattern. So I highly recommend the red moss for miniatures, but we're going to continue with this experiment over the next few months, and we're going to see exactly how it goes. So I'm going to go ahead and get, especially this mossy monster, I'm going to go ahead and get it cleaned up, and we'll be back. So we're back. I've got everything cleaned up, looking much better. You can actually see the plant now. I don't have to worry about any of my new growths getting smothered or anything like that from the top, and everything's just going to be a lot happier. It'll also provoke new growth lower down in the moss sections that we've cut. It'll branch out, and when it branches out, it tends to form smaller heads. So that's another nice trick and tip that I can give you guys. Again, we've taken so much off. I've actually plugged some of it onto other mounts, and they're getting more lush and more green every time we do this. It really is nice. But that's really my talk. Let me go hang these guys back up. We'll take a peek at them in better light and have a better chat that way. So we're back. Got them here on the watering rack, and that's the next topic of conversation. After we get this filled up, it'll probably help. Before I put these back, since they've been out for a few minutes, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take nice, clean, filtered water. Ignore the Epsom salt tag. I'm going to take nice, clean, filtered water, and I'm going to go ahead and spray the moss. Doesn't have to be dripping wet, but I do this every single day. The reason I do that is because it's honestly a lot harder to overwater when you're using live moss. The roots in the moss still get their nutrition, they still get their water and everything else, their hydration, but you've also got another organism now at this point that is dependent upon the water. So you've got something else that's helping you use up the excess water, and boy does it will dry fast if you're not careful, especially if you have a lot of airflow in your environment for the orchids. Having that said, don't be afraid to give it a quick mist every day. Again, doesn't have to be soaking, sopping, dripping wet, but it will help. It really will. All of these plants are low feeders. I don't have to worry about any fertilizers or anything doing any harm to the moss because, frankly, they just don't get a whole lot. They get very low levels of feed, and it's spaced out enough, with enough flushes in between to where it doesn't affect it too bad. Once the moss gets a little bit longer, and it has a little bit more trouble hydrating, that's when you'll notice a little bit of the blackening of the tips and things like that, but you seldom, if ever, see any discoloration on any of the moss that stays very well hydrated. So it is rather high maintenance. I do not think it's going to be for everybody, especially not in a mount, but it does look awesome, and it really does benefit the plant as well. I also have secondary theories about, the moss itself giving off oxygen and things like that to the roots because it photosynthesizes. It takes in carbon, it produces oxygen. So even in an environment that is much more saturated or wet than your typical mount would want to be, it's a whole different world using the zombie moss than using live moss because the live moss is actually also producing oxygen. There's also talk of moss having antiseptic properties and things like that, being good and beneficial for the orchids in many other ways. So that's really why I wanted to indulge in this experiment and see if everything really was true about it, and so far it really is. So that's my quick chat about using live moss with orchids. So far so good. As you see, the moss is still kicking, orchids are growing really nice, and if Draculas and Masdevallias, Lepanthes are happy and like it, and trust me, any other moist growing orchid that you can maintain this type of setup with will be appreciative as well. So that's it for today. Have a good one. Thank you for watching. Stay safe, and remember, happy growing.